The second part of Key Concept 2.1 is going to focus on the events in England and Poland, as well as absolutism in some of the eastern states and examples of enlightened absolutism in those states as well. Key Concept 2.1.1 Part D actually reads, the inability of the Polish monarchy to consolidate its authority over the nobility led to Poland's partition by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and its disappearance from the map of Europe. In general, throughout the 17th and 18th century, as Poland developed, unlike the absolute countries where kings were hereditary, the Polish king was elected, much like the Holy Roman Emperor. And as a result, the Polish Diet, or Sejm, SCJM, is going to gain considerable power, at times even putting foreigners on the throne of Poland. This all serves to weaken the Polish state, and beginning in the 1770s, Russia, Prussia, and Austria are going to partition Poland in a series of 3 partitions, and by 1795, Poland will essentially cease to exist, mainly due to the strong nobility and weak monarchy, further giving a little bit of validity to the views of Thomas Hobbes that strong absolute monarchies were needed during this time period in order to survive. However, there's also some views that are going to contradict Hobbes's, and the example in England and the development of constitutionalism will be a perfect example of that. Constitutionalism is going to develop in England and the Dutch Republic, and whereas the Dutch Republic developed an oligarchy of urban gentry, rural landowners to promote trade, protect traditional rights, the Constitutionalism of England is really going to ultimately lead to the movement known as liberalism, which will develop during the French Revolutionary period and thereafter. The constitution that developed in England was actually admired by the philosophes of the Enlightenment period and will become, like I said, the basis of, limited government throughout European history. And so a couple of characteristics of constitutionalism: often rules which are unwritten define and limit government. And although over time some of these rules are codified, for example, in England, there was the Magna Carta back in 1215, the Petition of Right, later on the English Bill of Rights, and so forth. But even the English Constitution is not a single document like the American Constitution, but rather a compilation of laws and tradition. They usually had some means of group decision-making. So the Dutch Republic, like I said, had an oligarchy. England had a parliament, which in a way was an oligarchy. Only 1 in 100 adult males could vote for parliament, for members of parliament, and the parliament was mostly made up of lords in the House of Lords and the commoners in the House of Commons, or the gentry. These commoners were not the common people as in the peasantry, but generally those that were very wealthy often, but not born to nobility. And constitutional government was also not a democracy. Democracy really is based on the franchise and the vote, and not all people had that right during this time period. However, it is based on the consent of the governed that provides the basis for legitimacy, its acceptance by the subject, falling into the theories and ideas of John Locke, that there is a social contract between the rulers and those that rule. Between the rulers and those that are ruled. And if the rulers do not rule in the interests of the people, those that rule have the right to revolt. And Locke's ideas really are accepted in the early 18th century as a result of his ideas and studies of the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution in that period in history. Nobles and bourgeoisie often had more power in the state, thus the House of Lords, whereas in the absolutist states, they were generally less confined. The nobles were forced to go to Versailles. And in England, Parliament essentially had to restrain some of the absolutist tendencies of both the Tudors and especially the Stuart kings, which is going to lead into this English Civil War. So, like I said, the best example of constitutional government was that which developed in England. And a little bit of background about England. The last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, was extremely popular, and she often was able to use Parliament to her advantage. She ruled for 44 years, from 1558 through 1603, and during that time, Parliament only met 13 times in 2-month sessions. She generally supported divine right, but she had the good sense not to say so out loud, And she also generally lived and governed within her means. She did leave the crown in debt, but she, like I said, was able to use Parliament during this time period to her advantage, and she was just too popular for Parliament to challenge. But after her death, Parliament, and particularly the House of Commons, wanted to increase its control over national policy. The House of Commons was dominated by the gentry, and do keep in mind that much of the gentry had adopted the ideas of English Calvinism, and they were Puritans. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church, get rid of the Catholic influence, and thus were very much opposed to the Catholics. Elizabeth had kind of had that don't ask, don't tell policy. But now we're going to see, some of the members of the gentry, especially the Puritan members, agitating for more power. And the gentry had kind of replaced the nobility as the dominant force. There are actually 15 to 20,000 gentry families that were quite powerful in England. Elizabeth had died without an heir, and so her cousins, the Stuarts, became the new king. And James I was the first Stuart monarch in 1603 from Scotland. He was also the king of Scotland. And his son, Charles, will succeed him to the throne in 1625. Both James and Charles generally ruled arrogantly and tactlessly, both claiming divine right openly. In fact, James wrote a tract, The True Law of the Free Monarchies, which essentially called for divine right type rule by the king. They followed an unpopular foreign policy of friendship at times with Catholic Spain, which further set off the Puritans. And they discriminated against the Puritans. If you guys remember from American history, in the 1630s, we'd see the Great Migration of Puritans escaping England for religious tolerance in the New World. They imprisoned opponents without a fair trial, often using the Court of the Star Chamber that we had talked about earlier. And they spent extravagantly, as well as raising money in means not approved by Parliament, such as ship money. Finally, soldiers were boarded in private homes without the owner's permission. And so there was a lot of irritation amongst members of Parliament, the gentry members, and especially the Puritan members. And when Charles, in 1628, essentially, was asking Parliament for money for war, and he wanted additional taxes to support the war, Parliament forced Charles to sign the Petition of Right. And this petition essentially limited the king's power. The king was forbidden to collect taxes or force loans without consent. He was no longer allowed to imprison people without just cause. He was no longer allowed to quarter troops. And he could not put the country under any type of military law. And Charles agreed, signed the Petition of Right in 1628, and then in 1629 dismissed Parliament and essentially ignored the Petition of Right. And for the next 11 years, from 1629 through 1640, Charles is going to rule England without calling Parliament into session. He is going to once again illegally raise money. He's going to illegally imprison his opponents. That illegal raising money was the ship tax on some of the port towns, not approved by Parliament. No habeas corpus. No, opponents were imprisoned without a trial. Like I said, the persecution of the Puritans became quite intense, and many are going to, like I said, go to the New World as well. And ultimately, it's going to these policies that are going to lead to the beginnings of the English Civil War in 1640. And so, in 1640, remember I said earlier, the Stuart kings were also the kings of Scotland. A Scottish rebellion is going to force Charles to call Parliament into session to ask for more money. He just simply couldn't do it any other way. And the House of Commons at this point refused to discuss anything without first venting their complaints about Charles' handling of religious and governmental issues. Charles dismissed this Parliament after 3 weeks. They were known as the Short Parliament, but he was still desperate for money, and so he had to summon Parliament once again. And so this new Parliament, this long Parliament, essentially is going to become a divided Parliament. Many of the influential Puritan members of the House of Commons were determined to decrease Charles's powers, and we're going to see groups form in Parliament. Royalists or pro-monarchy groups versus those that were anti-monarchist and those opposed to Charles. And in June of 1642, Parliament sends Charles 19 propositions, essentially a formulation of the Petition of Rights that would make Parliament the supreme power in England. Charles refused to agree to its demands and led troops into the House of Commons to arrest 5 of its leaders who were hidden and protected from capture. And in 1642, this was the spark of the English Civil War. Parliament, like I said, was divided. On one hand, you had the radicals, led by the Puritans, and Presbyterians, led by Oliver Cromwell, became known as the Roundheads. Then you had the Cavaliers, those that supported the king. They were generally the nobility, wealthy landowners, high Anglican clergy, and Catholics. And ultimately, the Roundheads, supported by the middle class and small landowners that had the support of the Scots, are going to borrow military techniques from the Swedes, from Gustavus Adolphus, and create this new model army. And we talked about that earlier. And by 1645, the Battle of Naseby was a decisive defeat for the Cavaliers, for the king's forces. After that, in 1646, the Parliament basically removed anyone that was opposed to the Puritans from Parliament, thus known as the Rump Parliament. It was called Pride's Purge, as Parliament was purged. Parliament captured Charles, convicted him, and ultimately beheaded him for treason against the nation, which actually shocked many English people, but reaffirmed that the king did not rule by divine right and was not above the law. Like I said, the trial was very suspicious. It was a purged parliament, and Charles was convicted by 1 vote, ultimately. Afterwards, we're going to see a brief period of time from 1649 through 1660, where it's known as the English Republic or the English Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell, declared England a republic, and Parliament, however, quarreled about how to do this and what to do, and ultimately Cromwell simply dismissed Parliament in 1653, took the title Lord Protector, and essentially ruled as a military dictator. He brutally crushed revolts in Scotland. He maintained an anti-Spanish foreign policy, and probably one of the most interesting things that he did was he essentially suppressed the Irish Catholics, took their land, gave it to English nobles and English gentry, and is going to further antagonize relations between the Irish and England and kind of lay the seeds for some of the issues that are going to come up in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries between the Irish and the English, where English absentee landowners are going to own the land in Ireland, and the poor Irish are going to work the land in pretty squalid conditions when all is said and done. Cromwell also tried to enforce Puritanism in England. No dancing, no card playing. He shut down the theaters, no sports. A very austere lifestyle, which really was not well accepted by the English subjects. He did try to close down the taverns, and that was just going too far. The English wouldn't allow that. But ultimately, when Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658, his son becomes the new Lord Protector. And at that point, Parliament kind of gets their act back together. They invite Charles II, the exiled son of Charles I, he was in France, to return to England and assume the throne. And in 1660, the English people cheered. The merry monarch, Charles II, returns to the throne. He pledged to observe the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right, to respect the authority of Parliament. And although at one point he had made a secret promise to Louis XIV to bring England back to Catholicism, he was very mindful of his father's fate. He avoided antagonizing Parliament. And for the most part, we're going to see the further development of a constitutional monarchy in England during this time. The Church of England remained the state religion, and we'll see that develop as well. One other interesting thing that develops after the Restoration was the development of political parties. Charles II did not have an heir, and his brother James was next in line. And whereas Charles was very mindful of his father's fate, James was not. James was a practicing Catholic. He advocated divine right. And what we're going to actually see are the 2 political parties that developed, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs formed to exclude James from the throne. The Tories defended the hereditary monarchy. And ultimately, the 2 parties came to a compromise where, as the Tories agreed to establish a principle of habeas corpus so that people could not be held in prison by the king without just cause or a fair trial, in turn, the Whigs agreed to support the hereditary monarchy, and in 1685, James became king. He was older. The English Parliament felt they would just deal with it, and When he died, his daughter was in the Netherlands. Her and her husband were Protestant. They figured they could come over and be Protestant kings. However, James had a son, a Catholic son, and the birth of this son aroused fear of continuing Catholic rule in England. And even though the Puritans were no longer in charge necessarily, their opposition to the Catholics continued, and to keep the peace, this fear of Catholic rule would divide England once again. And so in 1688, Parliament secretly offered the English crown to William, the Protestant ruler of the Netherlands, and his wife Mary, the Protestant daughter of James. And upon their arrival, James fled to France. There was very limited fighting. They call it the Bloodless Revolution or the Glorious Revolution. But essentially, this Glorious Revolution reaffirmed the supremacy of Parliament over the monarch, and there will no longer be challenges to Parliament by the kings. This officially ended any type of divine right, and in fact, the English Bill of Rights, passed the next year, further strengthened Parliament. There must be frequent meetings of Parliament. The monarch had to be Anglican in religion. It guaranteed basic civil liberties, including trial by jury, limited the right to petition government, laws against cruel and unusual punishment. It encouraged free debate within Parliament, and essentially strengthened Parliament as a whole. Furthermore, the Act of Settlement satisfied the Puritans by excluding any Catholic from inheriting the English throne, which is going to lead to some resentment from the Irish Catholics. And then the Toleration Acts will grant freedom of worship to non-Anglican sects of Protestantism, thus ensuring that the Puritans and other such groups are able to practice. Later on, the throne goes to Mary's sister Anne, who had no heir, and ultimately it's going to pass to the House of Hanover, who were German, and those kings will rule: George I, George II, and George III. You really don't need to know those, but just want to kind of let you know about how we see it. The one thing that you do need to know, though, as the German kings came into power in the 1700s, the first really didn't understand English customs, and so basically the executive power shifted to the prime minister or first minister. And remember, the English and British, they elect parties, not people. The prime minister would be the leader of the cabinet, and that would be the leader of the majority party in Parliament. And thus, this tradition continues and does continue through today. Another part of key concept 2.1 is also that after 1648, dynastic and state interests, along with Europe's expanding colonial empires, influenced the diplomacy of European wars and frequently led to war. And so I want to talk about, after the 30 Years' War and essential limitation of the Holy Roman Empire, what we're going to see in the German states is the rise of power of both Prussia and Austria. And so I want to talk first about Hohenzollern Prussia. In 1640, Frederick William, one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, inherited a scattered collection of territories in northern Germany known as Brandenburg and Prussia. He was essentially the elector of Brandenburg and the Duke of Prussia. And he's going to begin to consolidate these areas. He builds up Prussia. Number one, he builds up the idea, and this is important for all of Prussia, to associate Prussia with military. And so he begins a system where the Junkers, or nobility in Prussia, are made into officers within the nobility. And unlike France, the nobles who are in the military hold the highest positions. In turn, he also gives the nobles, or the Junkers, control over their estates. Thus, we're going to see the further encirclement of the free peasantry in Prussia. But in turn, for giving them full control over their estates, they give William control over the state. And we'll see Prussia develop under these guidelines. Frederick William also builds a strong standing army. He collects excise taxes in order to do so. And by his death in the 1680s, Prussia has almost the fourth largest army in Europe, despite the 10th largest population. In many ways, Prussia became known as the Sparta of the North for its continued insistence upon this military tradition that existed during that time period in Prussia. He is succeeded by William I, and really you don't need to know William, but you do need to know that during this time period, William is going to help the Austrians in the War of the Spanish Succession, and for that assistance, he is quickly king of Prussia, and thus we see now the kingdom of Prussia develop during this time period. Later on, one of the more important rulers was Frederick William I, the soldier king, who continued to build up his military and to develop Prussia, and he ruled through 1740. Although he was cruel by nature, he was going to continue the same traditions that had been continued during the time period prior to his rule, and Prussia becomes a state that encompasses a military. Frederick the Great inherits Prussia in 1740, and Frederick the Great was not expected to follow any type of policy that was similar to his father. Frederick the Great and Frederick William I were not very friendly. Frederick was very artistic, very cultural. He spoke French. He was very musical. He played the flute. And his father often beat him frequently, didn't think that he would amount to much. And so it was really quite surprising to see Frederick continue to build up this military that his father had started. And unlike his predecessors, Frederick the Great actually used the military. He is going to go to war against Maria Theresa in Austria, the War of the Austrian Succession, which we'll talk about later, fighting the 7 Years' War, continue to expand Prussia. And considering his background with his father, this really was quite unexpected for that time period. Furthermore, Frederick is also known as an enlightened and is going to create enlightened policies. And while you're not required to know about Frederick the Great, I think he's a pretty good one to use as an example. So some examples, if we look at the characteristics of enlightened despots, we're going to see, he invites the philosophes. Voltaire comes and lives at his court, and he plays with their ideas. Frederick limits capital punishment, limits torture in his realm, as a nod to this policy of enlightenment. He tries to increase education and actually at one point tries to make schooling mandatory amongst at least the upper classes, something that Catherine did as well, this compulsory schooling of the upper classes. Catherine had actually built a school for girls, which was, huge for that time period in that day. But so Frederick will increase education. Frederick will practice a policy of religious tolerance in Prussia as well. And even the Jewish population was allowed to practice their religion, although they did have to pay a special tax. And finally, like all despite this growth, these enlightened policies, Frederick, like I said, does continue to use his military, will take part in the partition of Poland, will fight wars with Austria, and will continue to develop and build up Prussia. Also rising from the ashes of the Holy Roman Empire will be Habsburg Austria. And a couple of things about that. First of all, from 1650s through the 1700s, we're going to see the expansion of the empire. Ultimately in 1683, they're going to defeat the Turks, and after they're defeated the Turks and the halt of the Ottoman advance in Europe, they're going to seize lands such as Hungary, Bohemia, and continue to build up the Austrian Empire into a multicultural empire. Furthermore, we're going to see a rivalry develop with Prussia, and especially after 1740, when Maria Theresa comes to the throne. Maria Theresa, her father, Charles VI, had essentially did not have a male heir, and so he issued a pragmatic sanction convincing the 300 plus German rulers to sign this, that they would not split the Habsburg possessions, and they could go on to a single heir, thus ensuring his daughter the crown. And so when Maria Theresa assumed the crown in 1740, it was assumed that they would follow this. However, led by Frederick the Great, the German states went to war, the War of the Austrian Succession. We'll talk about that later. Know that Maria Theresa did survive the war. As a leader, she was really determined to strengthen the state by centralizing the government, promoting commerce, and limiting the power of the nobles, including taxing of the nobles. And she actually, it's interesting, she's not considered an enlightened despot, but she reduced the power of the lords over their serfs and probably did more to help serfs than any other European ruler of the 18th century, except her son, who actually ended serfdom. She revamped the tax system. She, also reduced conflict between provinces, and she, wanted to bring even relation between the church and state under control. Although she was a very staunch conservative Catholic, she considered the church and the nobility to be the foundation of the Austrian state. She was also a political realist. She did not want the papacy to influence Austrian politics, and she was concerned with the well-being and freedom of her subjects. She built up the Austrian army from 30,000 to about 100,000 by getting the various estates to accept the tax reforms, and ultimately, like I said, did involve Austria in the War of the Austrian Succession and 7 Years' War. Her son Joseph is really the model enlightened despot, and so mixed up our enlightened despots. We have Catherine the Great, we have Frederick the Great, we have Joseph II. Generally, the enlightened despots wanted to be more tolerant of religion, and so in Joseph's example, he will actually make all religions free in Austria. And this was pretty huge. Remember, Austria was a Catholic state. To be Habsburg was to be Catholic. Kind of the one thing in European history affairs that has been constant. This changes under Joseph. And in fact, he even gives full emancipation to the Jewish population within Austria. In addition to that, Joseph, with religion, just to kind of give you an idea, the others, Frederick the Great also did much of the similar things. Catherine the Great extended some acceptance of the old believers in Russia. Joseph also wanted to increase education. So one of his components of this was that he wanted to make reforms that would make, compulsory schooling. And although this sounded ideal, it just really was a little bit too far ahead of its time, a little bit too much. Impossible. The Great also increased schooling. She built a school for girls. It is interesting. The school had very harsh rules. It was believed that if these girls, they had to be from the upper class, but it was believed that if their life was too easy in this school, they wouldn't be able to learn. So it's like always kept cold and so forth with them. Frederick also tried to increase education, built schools, tried to have more, at least the upper classes, go to school during this time period, and this continued. Another reform of the Enlightened despots was the reformed judicial system. Once again, Catherine did the great instruction. Joseph tried to make greater equality for all classes during this time period. He also had freedom of the press, in all of that. But the most radical reform Joseph made was when he abolished serfdom in 1781. He decreed all peasant labor obligations be converted to cash payments. And interestingly, this was not just violently rejected by the nobility, but also violently rejected by the peasants. The peasants had already been on a barter system, and changing their economy to cash payments would hurt them. Really, by 1790, after the death of Joseph, the law was rescinded, and the peasants lost whatever little gains they had made. And overall, although Joseph, made had great ideas, very idealistic, really a child of the Enlightenment, he just had no real support. The church was opposed, the nobles were opposed, the peasants misunderstood and were opposed. He just simply went too far too fast, and most of his reforms went away after his death. Also, during this time period, we're going to see the development of the British-French rivalry. And so the 1700s, we see on one hand, in the Western Europe, we see the British and French rivals, and especially colonial rivalries. They're going to fight wars in North America as well as Europe, most notably the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War in North America, known as King George's War, and the French and Indian War. But also, in addition to the British-French rivalry, we're seeing this development of this Prussian-Austrian rivalry in Central Europe once Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa come to the throne. And being they came to the throne in 1740, the first war fought was the War of the Austrian Succession. In this war, Frederick essentially wanted to carve up the Habsburg Empire, and he seized an area known as Silesia from Austria. Silesia was really pretty rich. and it actually doubled Prussia's population, doubled their resources. And after 8 years, the war ended. It really was a draw. Frederick failed in the fact that the Habsburg Empire remained intact. Maria Theresa appealed to the Hungarians nobles who gave full support. They were able to keep Frederick from grabbing anything else, but he did get to keep Silesia and gain the enemy of Maria Theresa. During this war in the British colonies and the French colonies in North America, it was called King George's War, where the war itself was also somewhat of a draw. Colonial soldiers had seized Louisbourg, but at the end of the war, it was given back. In 1756, a more serious war breaks out in Europe, the 7 Years' War. This war had actually begun 2 years earlier in North America between the British and the French in the French and Indian War, once again over colonial claims. And in North America, as a result of the French and Indian War, the British really gained control of most of the continent east of the Mississippi River. They took all of Canada as well from the French, and the French were confined to really their islands, their Caribbean. However, do keep in mind the French Caribbean was extremely valuable and would have been much greater of a loss than all of that territory. In Europe, the 7 Years' War was Maria Theresa's revenge, and she was able to get the French to side with her, as well as Russia, and she went to war against Prussia, and her attempt was to carve up the Prussian Empire of Frederick the Great. She was not successful, although it came really close, but when Russia withdrew from the war at the last minute, the war ended in a draw, and after that we kind of see the rivalry continue, but the end of the massive warfare between the two German monarchs, and both Prussia and Austria continue to grow as the strongest German states through the 19th century. This is the end of part 2. Stay tuned for part 3, the French Revolution and Napoleonic era.